Financial pressure has been one of the key tools the West has used against Russia since Vladimir Putin launched his Ukraine invasion in February 2022. Sanctions upon sanctions have been implemented. Right now, Russia is dealing with 24,311 sanctions from Europe, the US, and other nations that affect everything from oil sales to how oligarchs conduct business abroad. That pressure has come to bear. The complete meltdown of the Russian economy is coming, and if things continue as they are, Russia might be spiraling to depths not seen since the Soviet era. The data is devastating. Russia's economic meltdown is coming, and Putin is scrambling. That's according to The Express, which wrote on July 1st that a myriad of signs have appeared that demonstrate just how bad Russia's economy is doing. Oil revenue has nosedived, the outlet says, and even the price of pork has rocketed up by 15%. As The Express says, skyrocketing prices of pork and falling oil prices are said to be driving a drop in Russia's budget. Russia is struggling with food price inflation as the Kremlin continues to pour billions of pounds into defense as it continues to wage war in Ukraine. The oil issue is a major problem for Putin. On June 4th, Bloomberg reported that proceeds from oil sales being delivered to Russia's state budget had dropped to their lowest since June 2023 due to a global decline in crude oil prices. The figures make for painful reading for Putin. Taxes related to oil in Russia dropped to $5.5 billion in June 2025. Though that seems like a lot of money, it represents a 32% decline in the amount of money Russia was pulling in from oil the previous year. The picture doesn't get any prettier when you add Russia's other major natural resource, gas, into the mix. If anything, it gets worse. Combined oil and gas sales are down by over 35%, meaning Russia can't fall back on gas to save it from its faltering oil sales. Breaking the figures down by the barrel, we can see the root of Russia's oil problems, Bloomberg points out. It says that Russia's finance ministry calculated its oil taxes based on a per-barrel price of $54.76 in April, which is a price that's about 25% lower than it was during the same month in 2024. Ironically, the strengthening of the Russian ruble also played a role in Russia's oil revenue problems. Appreciation of 10% of the currency led to a single US dollar being equivalent to 83.317 rubles for the current tax period. That exchange rate reduces the price of crude oil in rubles, ultimately leading to less profit being generated from the resource. There are even more signs of oil problems with the disbursements Russia is paying out for gasoline and diesel supplies to its domestic market. In May, that disbursement was a touch under $540 million, which is the lowest it's been since October 2023, when Russia meted out zero payments. Oilprice.com focuses on Russian gas and oil firms with its data. It says that these firms saw their new profits fall to $9.9 billion during the first quarter of 2025. Again, that seems like a lot of money, but when you compare it to the same period in 2024, it represents a near 50% decrease in profits. The first quarter of 2024 saw these same companies pull in $18 billion in net profits. This isn't a problem related to volume, the outlet says. The volume of Russian crude oil exports in the 4 weeks to May 25th barely changed from the previous 4 weeks to May 18th, but the value of shipments dropped to the lowest level since April 2023, according to data reported by Bloomberg's Julian Lee, says oilprice.com. And therein lies the problem Putin faces. It's not that Russia isn't selling plenty of oil, it is. His issue is that the value of oil has diminished so severely that he'd have to sell nearly twice as much as he has in the past to make the same amount of money. Prices for Russia's flagship Urals crude oil are hovering around the $50 per barrel mark, which is $10 lower than the $60 price cap forced on Russia by European and US sanctions. And it's not going to get better for Russia as the year progresses. In May, oilprice.com reported that Russia had slashed its revenue forecasts from oil by 24% for the year. It now expects to generate an annual total of $101.7 billion from its oil, rather than the $133.7 billion forecast at the beginning of 2025. That has knock-on effects for the entire Russian economy. Russia expected oil to account for 5.1% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, for the year. That's down 2. Now, oil sales are predicted to account for 3.7% of the country's GDP, suggesting Putin is scrambling to find other revenue sources to keep Russia's economy ticking over. US President Donald Trump's tariff wars seem to be partially to blame for Russia's oil woes. That's according to Russia's central bank governor Elvira Nabiullina, who said in May, "If the escalation of the tariff wars continue, this usually leads to a decline in global trade and the global economy and, possibly, demand for our energy resources. Therefore, there are risks here." Trump doesn't seem intent on giving up on his tariffs anytime soon. And if he focuses on Russia An already bad situation for the country's oil industry could evolve into a problem that devastates the country's economy. Then there's the pork problem. According to the Express, a single kilogram of pork in live weight, which amounts to about 2.2 pounds, has risen by 15% to hit $2.96. That's in Russia's central district, which includes the capital city of Moscow, meaning pork prices may be higher elsewhere. The Express also says that the price of pork has risen by 7% in June alone, showcasing that this is an ongoing problem. Pig Progress said in 2024 that the price of grain in Russia is contributing to that pork problem. Back in March 2024, production costs for 2.2 pounds of pork were projected to hit $1.11, which represented an $8 increase over the costs seen during the previous year. As we know now, $1.11 seems cheap compared to the figures from June 2025. The problem, the outlet said at the time, came down to Russian farmers being forced to pay more for the grain needed to feed their pigs. That price rose almost 50% to around $210 per ton in 2024. All of this amounts to one thing for Russia's consumers: higher prices at the supermarket. And that's why the pork problem is so important to Russia's economy. If it was pork alone that was skyrocketing in price, that would be an issue, but one that Russia could handle. Instead, the pork problem is merely a microcosm of a much wider food inflation issue that's affecting all of Russia to the point where many of its people are struggling to afford to put food on the table. Trading Economics offers an overview. It points out that the cost of food in Russia is increasing by a staggering 12.49% in May 2025 alone, when compared to the same month in 2024. That's symptomatic of a wider food inflation problem that's resulted in Russia experiencing 9.2% inflation per year on average between 2002 and 2025. This year has been a particular problem for Russia in that arena. Between January and April, food inflation rose month on month. It was 11.13% in January, followed by 11.68% in February, 12.42% in March, and 12.66% in April. Ironically, the 12.49% we see for May represents the first decline seen since October 2024, though it's a decline that's so minuscule as to have almost no positive impact on Russian food prices. Statista also provides some information in a chart showcasing how much the price of individual foods changed in Russia between the end of December 2024 and February 3, 2025. In a little over a month, average Russians found themselves paying 11.05% more for a fresh cucumber. They paid 9.22% more for lamb, 5.65% more for onions, and 5.54% more for apples. Even the stereotypical Russian staples of vodka and potatoes were affected. Their prices rose by 6.76% and 3.6% respectively. What we have here is a widespread problem affecting everyday Russians. Pork is just one example. Almost everything that a Russian might want to eat now costs much more than it did in 2024, and in some cases, a lot more than it cost just a few months ago. These food inflation woes add to an already perilous financial situation for everyday Russians, who are already struggling with 20% interest rates that make it harder for them to take out loans, and overall inflation that has been above 9% and has hit higher than 10% for several months since December 2024. The takeaway from all of this is simple. Putin's Ukraine invasion has created a world of hurt for his people and the wider Russian economy, and Russia knows it. The Express reports that the problems have become so severe that the Kremlin has been forced to recalculate Russia's federal budget for the year due to expected annual income taking a tumble. The budget for 2025 was originally set to about $509 billion. Now it's been revised to $486 billion, a 4 to 5% decrease from initial projections. The BBC's Russian news editor, Steve Rosenberg, provided even more details in a video he shared to X. The footage shows him reading through a Russian newspaper, where he finds an article detailing amendments to Russia's federal budget. The main reason for the drop in revenue is clear: the fall in revenue from the sale of oil and gas. Rosenberg quotes the article as saying. He adds that Russia initially calculated its budget based on an optimistic belief that it would be charging $69.7 per barrel in 2025. We know that Russia was wrong and that the real price per barrel is close to $15 lower. The new forecast is based on oil prices being around $56. And it could get worse. It's quite possible in the autumn another adjustment to the budget will be necessary, Rosenberg quotes the paper as saying. However, the newspaper also claims that Russia will still be able to fulfill its budget obligations and that everyday Russians don't need to fear any changes made to the tax system to boost federal revenues. They just get to deal with the rampant inflation, higher food prices, and eye-watering interest rates instead. The blame for all of this rests squarely on Putin's shoulders. For several years, he's been able to hide the true state of Russia's economy through growth figures inflated by the military-industrial economy he's created. By placing Russia on a war footing, Putin was able to tout growth of 3.6% in 2023 and 4.1% in 2024, beating out several Western nations in the process. But behind those high numbers lay the murky truth that this growth wouldn't have happened were it not for the changes Russia has made to its economy to keep its war of attrition against Ukraine running. The reality is that Russia's entire economy has stood on shaky foundations for several years and is wholly unsustainable. That's according to Vision of Humanity, which wrote that the 4.1% growth seen in 2024 was driven almost entirely by Putin's wartime spending and state interventions. The typical drivers of growth, which included increases in productivity and structural reforms, are nowhere to be seen. We see this problem in the cash Russia is paying out to its soldiers and military contractors, Vision of Humanity says. Between 2022 and 24, budgetary and quasi-budgetary injections exceeded 10% of GDP, with over 3% in 2024 alone. These funds propped up both demand and supply. Soldiers and their families received cash transfers and pensions were indexed, while military industries benefited from subsidies, tax breaks, and preferential loans, according to the resource. While manufacturing sectors with direct ties to defense enjoyed double-digit growth, others have floundered. Around half of Russia's coal companies reported losses at the end of 2024. Oil and gas revenues are in decline, as we've already noted. And Russia is dealing with the dual issues of one of its worst labor shortages ever and wage growth outpacing productivity. Nationally, Russia has an unemployment rate of just 2.3%, dropping to 1.5% in some key industrial regions, which is a sign that there simply aren't enough people to go around for the jobs being advertised in the country. On the wage front, real wages in Russia rose by 4.6% year-on-year in April 2025. Over the first 4 months of 2025, real wages rose 4.8%. These increases are taking place at a time when Russia's productivity is tanking. According to Medusa, civilian economic output in the country fell by 0.8% during the same quarter, when wages rose by 4.8%. In March 2025 alone, productivity dropped by 1.1%. All of these problems are symptoms of the wartime economy Putin has created. Plenty of people are being hired by military factories, but that's created an unemployment situation where civilian companies struggle to find talent. Wages are rising, sure, but inflation is taking a big bite out of those increases and Russia's productivity has tanked. It's not making enough products to sell abroad, which is part of the reason why it's been so reliant on oil and gas during the Ukraine war. With revenues from those industries also declining, Russia is now standing on the precipice of an economic collapse that could ruin the country and plunge it back to the lows of the worst of the Soviet era. The numbers don't make for good reading, and they mean that Putin is going to have to deal with several problems as we move deeper into 2025 and then onto 2026 and beyond. The military is going to be hit hard. In fact, that hit is already starting to happen. Toward the end of February, Euromaidan Press reported that Russia was spending about $1 billion per day to fund the Ukraine invasion. Ukraine's military intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, highlighted how abnormal this was. "This is an extremely expensive war," he said at the time. "A day of war costs slightly less than $1 billion for them. This is a huge amount of money." Budanov implied that Putin's spending simply couldn't be sustained for much longer. A few months later, he was proven right. On June 28th, Putin announced that Russia would reduce its defense spending. Next year and the year after, over the next 3-year period. Though Russia's leader didn't provide details, his announcement came after multiple warnings from Russian economic experts that the country is close to going into recession. That's something that Putin is determined not to allow happen. On June 20th, he said as much to attendees of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, stating, "This must not be allowed to happen under any circumstances. We need to pursue a competent, well-thought-out budgetary, tax, and monetary policy." Those feel like empty words from a president whose invasion is the chief cause of the very problems for which he's now claiming he will find solutions. During the same conference, Elvira Nabiullina noted, "We have been growing for 2 years at a fairly high rate due to the fact that free labor resources were used. But we need to understand that many of these resources have really been exhausted. We need to think about a new model for growth." Translation: Russia's wartime economy is collapsing in on itself. That's why Putin is making cuts to the country's defense spending. He needs the money these cuts will save to attempt to drag Russia out of the economic black hole into which the Ukraine war has sucked it. Of course, this is bad news for Russia's military ambitions in 2025 and beyond. It's amid a summer offensive in Ukraine that the Washington Post says is already mired in problems that include a lack of equipment. If Russia is going to spend less on its military, those equipment problems won't be solved. For Russian soldiers on the ground, that amounts to fewer tanks, armored vehicles, artillery guns, anti-aircraft defenses, and other equipment upon which they rely to attack Ukraine and defend themselves. In short, more Russians will die thanks to the country's economic situation. Looking toward the long term, Russia's economic outlook is increasingly bleak, and again it all comes down to Putin's war. The Bank of Finland bulletin states that Russia has now one of the world's lowest projected long-term growth rates, with only Belarus, a Russian ally, having lower projections according to the bank's figures. Between 2028 and 2030, the bank says, Russia is barely going to scrape past 1% GDP growth during a period when Ukraine is hitting over 4%. The bank also points to the productivity problems we mentioned earlier, stating, Russia has consistently performed poorly in international productivity comparisons for many decades. The output per hour worked, PPP adjusted, in Russia is still only about half that of the US or Euro area. Rosstat figures also show that labor productivity declined between 2021 and 2023, and Russia isn't likely to be able to fix these problems. The changes Putin has made to the country's economy that now fuel his war machine are long-lasting and can't be reversed easily. Today, all of Russia's economic policies are subordinate to Putin's Ukraine objectives, meaning nothing changes unless Putin decides to give up on his supposed special military operation. That doesn't seem likely to happen soon, given that Putin's main conditions for peace would essentially eradicate Ukraine, so the war will keep plugging along. And with each passing month, Putin's policies will do more and more damage to a Russian economy that is already teetering on the edge. Not helping matters from the Russian perspective is that pressure continues to be piled onto it by Ukraine's European allies. On June 20th, Al Jazeera reported that the European Commission has floated a new plan that would see the European Union, or EU, phase out all of its Russian gas imports by the end of 2027. If a similar plan is put in place for Russian oil, then the revenue decreases we spoke about earlier in the video will just be the starting point for much bigger problems in the future. Even less money will be coming into Russia, and that money won't be coming back in the future. After all, the EU will have to find alternative suppliers for gas under its new plans. Once it has those suppliers in place, Putin will be hard-pressed to convince his former customers to come back, regardless of the outcome of the Ukraine war. What we have here is a meltdown in process. Russia hasn't plumbed to the deepest depths possible, yet. But that's more bad news for Putin. His country is already creaking under the weight of his expansionist ambitions, and it's only going to get worse from here. The collapse is in progress. The only question now is how long Russia has left before it finds itself in financial ruin. And it's not just the financial numbers that are going against Russia. There are plenty of other numbers that reveal why Putin will never achieve his objectives in Ukraine, including numbers related to territory, Russian casualties, and even the president's age. Find out more in our video covering the numbers that reveal Putin can never win in Ukraine. And remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the crisis Putin has created for his country.